Okay. Yeah. For the better part of the last decade, the most exciting political actor has been the crowd. Worldwide, we feel the opposition of the crowd in demonstrations, riots, occupations, and sometimes revolutions. I'm going to talk today, is Mike all right? Yeah? I'm going to talk today about the political opening of the crowd event, the excitement that crowds incite, particularly in contrast to the melancholia of left intellectuals who traffic in failure and misery. My claim is that the crowd signals the paradoxical power of the people as a political subject. And by people here, I mean the people as the rest of us, the people divided from elites and rulers, the people as an unavoidably split subject. To be clear, the crowd is not the people, and the crowd is not a political subject. Rather, the people appear as the subject of politics when the innovation of the crowd event can be attributed to them retroactively as an effect of and infidelity to the egalitarian crowd discharge. This retroactive determination links, I think, to questions from this morning of temporality, particularly as they inflect our thinking about history. So to make the argument today, I'm going to bring Elias Canetti together with Alain Badiou, connecting Canetti's account of the crowd with Badiou's discussion of subjectivation and subjective process from theory of the subject. Even though Badiou himself would no longer agree, I argue that maintaining fidelity to the egalitarian crowd discharge is the task of a communist party. An international communist party faithful to the global crowds can make them appear as the people, giving a politics to the international force that they already are. Now, I'm going to begin with history, with a brief discussion of the crowd, Hippolyte Taine's account of crowds in the French Revolution. Written in the aftermath of the Paris Commune of 1871, Taine's description is at the basis of much of late 19th century crowd theory. It influenced, for example, the notorious Gustave Le Bon's famously reactionary book, The Crowd. Taine's portrayal of the crowd as a being, a provisional heterogeneous unity, continues to serve as a prototype for crowd description. Taine describes a tumultuous, buzzing swarm. Quote, "The starving, the ruffians, and the patriots all form one body, and henceforth misery, crime, and public spirit unite to provide an ever-ready insurrection for the agitators who desire to raise one." End quote. Taine's crowd doesn't have a politics. It's the opportunity for politics. Need, violence, and a sense of justice reinforce each other. The crowd manifests collective desire, but without telling us for what. Taine ventriloquizes in advance 21st century internet commentary. We see this in the passage here. In this pell-mell of improvised politicians, no one knows who is speaking. Nobody is responsible for what he says. Each is there as in the theater, unknown among the unknown, requiring sensational impressions and transports, a prey to the contagion of passions around him. Borne along in the whirl of sounding phrases of ready-made news, growing rumors, and other exaggerations by which fanatics keep outdoing each other. Here in the upheaval of the crowd, there's no clear or singular demand. There is no person of known responsibility. The setting is one of rumor without knowledge and rhetoric without basis. People in the crowd are speaking, and their collective desire exceeds what is individually spoken. In sum, the crowd is a temporary desiring being. It does not have a specific politics. It doesn't have a history. It's not characterized by a relation to a leader. The crowd is a provisional unity of concentrated sensations. Canetti takes up this sensational crowd body. He associates the crowd with a primal fear, the fear of being touched, particularly by the strange or unknown. Only in the crowd, the denser the better, is this fear of being touched shed. As soon as a man has surrendered himself to the crowd, he ceases to fear its touch, Canetti writes. Suddenly, it is as though everything were happening in one and the same body. This is perhaps one of the reasons why a crowd seeks to close in on itself. It wants to rid each individual as completely as possible of the fear of being touched, end quote. As the crowd provisionally coalesces into its heterogeneous being, norms of appropriate proximity dissolve. Conventional hierarchies collapse. In place of the distinctions mobilized to produce the individual form, there's a temporary being of multiple mouths, anuses, stomachs, hands, and feet, a being comprised of fold upon fold of touching skin. Canetti describes the moment of the crowd's emergence as the discharge. This is the point when all who belong to the crowd get rid of their differences and feel equal. Up until that point, there may be a lot of people, but they are not yet that concentration of bodies and affects that is a crowd. The increase in the crowd's density, however, has libidinal effects. Canetti writes, and here's this passage, in that density, where there is scarcely any space between, and body presses against body, each man is as near to the other as he is to himself, and an immense feeling of relief ensues. It is for the sake of this blessed moment, when no one is greater or better than another, that people become a crowd. Canetti gives us the crowd as a strange attractor of jouissance, a figure of collective enjoyment. The libidinal energy of the crowd binds it together for a blessed moment. Canetti renders this moment as a feeling of equality in the shared intensity of belonging. The feeling of equality won't last. Inequality will return with the dissipation of the crowd. But in the orgasmic discharge, a state of absolute equality supplants individuating distinctions. Particular interests, preferences, and opinions are momentarily erased in the heterogeneous unity of the collective. Now, Canetti's crowd equality clearly has nothing to do with Freud's imaginary equality of rivals, nor does it resemble bourgeois equality of the sort Marx excoriates in the Critique of the Gotha program. This is not the formal equality of a common standard applied to different people, objects, or expenditures of labor. Rather, the equality Canetti invokes is one where a head is a head, an arm is an arm, and the differences between individual heads and arms is irrelevant. De-individuation accompanies intense belonging. Just as Marx parenthetically notes that unequal individuals, quote, would not be different individuals if they were not unequal, end quote, so does Canetti associate inequality with differentiation, with the siphoning off of the fluid, mobile substance of collectivity into distinct individuals. The force of equality in the crowd breaks down the always fragile and imaginary enclosure of the individual form, enabling the collective to experience its collectivity. Canetti argues that the crowd's equality infuses all demands for justice. Equality as belonging, not separation, weighing, and measure, is what gives energy, and that's Canetti's term, to the longing for justice. Now, too many castigate the crowd for its destructiveness without looking into why the crowd destroys. Such castigation reduces the crowd to the mob, siding with the most reactionary responses to the disruptive force of many. Canetti, however, associates destructiveness with the egalitarian discharge, almost as if the crowd were crying out in ecstasy. The noise of destruction adds to its satisfaction. Sounds of shattering glass augment the jubilation of the crowd. Promising continued growth and movement, the noise prolongs enjoyment. Quoting Canetti, the din is the applause of objects. Particularly satisfying is the destruction of boundaries. Nothing is off limits because there are no limits. The windows and doors that make houses into spaces for individuals apart from the crowd are smashed. Quote, in the crowd, the individual feels that he is transcending the limits of his own person. He has a sense of relief for the distances are removed which used to throw him back on himself and shut him in. With the lifting of these burdens of distance, he feels free. His freedom is the crossing of these boundaries," end quote. Crowds are a force of desire exerted by collectivity. When they amass in spaces authorized by neither capital nor the state, they breach the given, installing a gap of possibility. The presence of a crowd is a positive expression of negation. We are against you. People act together in ways impossible for individuals, who in their dispersion can lose the will or capacity to register their own being against. Pushing back against dominant arrangements that reformat confusion, sensation, and desire into consent, or at least acquiescence, the crowd prefigures a collective egalitarian possibility, but prefigures in a completely literal way prior to figuration. The crowd by itself, unnamed, doesn't present an alternative. It cuts out an opening by breaking through the limits bounding permitted experience. People are there, but through the active desire of the crowd differently from how they were before, combined into a state of such absolute equality that differences between individual heads and arms are irrelevant. Together, previously separate people impress the possibility of the people as the collective subject of a politics. The crowd provides an opportunity for the emergence of a political subject. It doesn't determine this emergence. It can't control the politics to which it gives rise. But this politics can itself proceed with more or less fidelity to the crowd event, attempting to carry on and out its equality, or trying to repress, deny, and dissipate it. The crowd's chaotic moment is indeterminate. To fetishize this indeterminacy dematerializes the crowd, extracting the affective intensities rupturing a given setting from the rupture itself, as if the crowd event were nothing more than an opportunity for interpretation. We could call this the anarchist error. Conversely, disavowing indeterminacy represses the egalitarian discharge as it claims prior knowledge of the crowd, reducing it to what was already given. Instead of a new momentary being, there's nothing but what had been there all along, our specific national crowds farcically repeating the histories they cannot change. We could call this the democratic era, consolidating into democracy, emphases on difference and individuated forms of political expression. But the crowd is not a political subject. It opens up the opportunity for a political subject to have been present. The political challenge is maintaining fidelity to the egalitarian expression of the many, the crowd discharge. Part of this challenge stems from the fact that fidelity itself is an effect of the crowd. Badiou's treatment in Theory of the Subject of Marx's response to the crowd event that ushered in the Paris Commune explores this point. So now I'm going to explain this kind of retroactive determination or this temporality that Badiou describes. Marx's theoretical commitments had opposed him to the insurrection. Nevertheless, Marx was faithful to the crowd event, retroactively finding there the movement of the working people. Prior to its occurrence, the insurrection was practically unimaginable. Over the previous months, attempts to incite it had failed. But the impossible happens, compelling Marx to take a stand. Whose side is he on? Here is the unpredictability of the subject as an exciting cause, the people forcing a change of theory and practice. As Marx says in his letter to Kugelmann, no matter the Commune's multiple tactical and policy errors, quote, the present rising in Paris, even if it be crushed by the wolves, swine, and vile curs of the old society, is the most glorious deed of our party since the June insurrection in Paris. Marx sees the Parisian crowd from the perspective of our party, claiming the Commune as a victory for the working people. Badiou notes that Marx criticizes the Commune in this same letter. After praising the elasticity, historical initiative, and sacrifice of the Parisians, Marx chides them, first, for missing the moment when they failed to march on Versailles. He faults them, second, for eliminating the Central Committee of the National Guard and holding elections to institute the Commune. Now, the order that Marx lists these criticisms is weird. It's seemingly backwards because the first is a consequence of the second, right? The second thing happened first. Badiou, drawing from Lacan's discussion of anticipation and certainty, explains the underlying logic. Marx is using what he imagines Versailles' reaction would have been to register the Commune event as the act of a political subject. And here's the quote from Badiou. I'm going to go ahead and read it to enter it into the symbolic, and then give a gloss on it, because I find it a little bit opaque. And so I'll read it and then explain it. Marx judges the Commune to be precipitating, subjectivizing in its political haste, and blames it for not marching onto Versailles. But this is in order to indicate retroactively the nature of the certainty of victory, of which this haste itself could be the bearer, insofar as it could be deciphered in the other, in the initial disorder and surprise of the inhabitants of Versailles, and in the possibility of changing the lack into reason by a second haste, that of the military offensive against Versailles. The latter would then be finally caught up in the subjective process, that is to say, in a consequent political direction, which is the only validation of the vanishing algebra of the Parisian masses into a consistent subject. In other words, to understand an event as the effect of a political subject, Badiou conjoins two operations, subjectivization and subjective process. We will win. We will be shown to have been right. The certainty of the political subject, we will win, is always too soon. An anticipation of results it cannot guarantee, but pursues nonetheless. Precipitous certainty is another name for political will. Rather than an amorphous combination of multiple possibilities, the subject is borne by its haste in a direction that cuts through this multiplicity. We find evidence of this direction in the other. The response of the other, its disorder and surprise, indicates the presence of a subject. The other sees action and attributes it to the purpose and will of a subject. That the other can do nothing but respond, that it cannot proceed as it had, is the work of the subject. In Badiou's formulation, in subjectivization, certainty is anticipated. In the subjective process, consistency is retroactive. To put into consistency the haste of the cause, therein lies the whole enigma of the subject, end quote. Each operation, subjectivization and subjective process, involves political struggle. Organizers produce actions. They try to bring people out, get them to feel their power, and incite them to use it. They are alert to possibilities, to protests that may become ruptures. And, consequent to the gap of a disruption, the party works to render the disruption as an effect of the subject. The party fights on the terrain of the other, endeavoring to ensure that the gap remains, and to give this gap meaning and direction, to make it consistent. So, for example, after an initial crowd event, subsequent crowd events are attributed to the people. The multiple events demonstrate not political contingency or a variety of different events that should be specified, understood for national historical reasons, and so on. Instead, this is the movement of the people against those who would oppress and exploit them. Enemies fight back. They don't want the subject to appear, so they try to close the gap as quickly as possible. Enemies and even democratic allies may deny that a disruption occurred. Nothing significant happened. The demonstration or event was within the field demarcated by capital and state, part of business as usual, an expected and permitted protest, child-friendly and within the demarcated free speech zone. Some democratic allies may deny that the disruption was the effect of the people as subject. It was thugs, Democrats often want to confine political action to speaking and voting. Some anarchist allies may also deny that the disruption was the effect of the people as subject. It was a motley and contingent array of disparate voices. Anarchists like to emphasize plurality, the multitude of singularities, rather than the provisional heterogeneous unity of the crowd. Allies may also attribute the crowd disruption to the wrong subject, to another state, class, or agency. So we need a party to inscribe the people in the subjective process initiated by the crowd, to politicize the rupture and force it in one direction rather than another. Without a party, the people can be hard to see. Their acts instead become co-opted and displaced, channeled and packaged so as to buttress the system they oppose. Not every crowd disrupts and surprises. Subjectivization can't be predicted, expected, or natural, for that would mean that it remained within the order of things. Rather than the intrusion of a subject, the people would not have appeared at all. There is a gap between a move that may disrupt and the disruption as it registers in the other, an anticipation and a lag. The lag means that effects seem to precede their causes. Only after an effect registers is the cause brought into consistency with it. The people, as the collective subject of politics, are the force in the gap between anticipation and lag. The role of the party is holding open this gap so that the force can appear. More than a body focused on the state, the party is a form for the expression and direction of political will. It's the people as political subject that concerns the party. How can it hasten their advance? How can it not stand in their way? How can it inscribe and extend their victories? The party concentrates disruption in a subjective process in order to produce political power. These acts are connected. They demonstrate the strength of the collective. The party endeavors to arrange the intensity unleashed by the crowd to keep it present as fervent desire. Confronted by the crowd event of the Paris Commune, Marx sees the people as a subject and its struggle as enduring, our party. The subject that expresses itself in the common event is not the diffusion of creative individuality. Dominant power always allows for the carnivalesque. It's rather the people in common as they manifest in the closure of directed intensity within the revolutionary opening. As Badiou writes, when Marx takes it upon himself to listen to the revolutionary activity of his time, to the popular historical disorder, it's a matter of pinpointing in the latter, pursuant to harsh theoretical and practical work, the dialectical form of the political subject as such. The deduction of its general activity presupposes only the riots of the 19th century, end quote. Given the crowds and riots of the last decade, we too can deduce the activity of the political subject in the present. Okay, to conclude, I've emphasized two aspects of the crowd event: egalitarian discharge and the gap between anticipation and lag. The crowd directs us back to the party because of the opening the crowd event creates. The party, specifically the Party of Communists, is that body which, in fidelity to the egalitarian discharge, can make the subjectivity of the people appear in the gap. The crowd then should not be equated with the multitude. Rather than a multitude of singularities, the crowd is a provisional being. Rather than a subject, it is the opportunity for the retroactive appearance of the subject. Capitalist democracy relies on the desubjectification of the people. It separates them into demographic groups, identities, and individuals, seeking to render these fragments serviceable for capitalism. When we see from the perspective of capitalist democracy, the people don't appear, we only see difference. The crowd event, the discharge, supplies a material but non-identitarian basis for an international communist party. More than active movement, which it is, the discharge is the egalitarian moment of collectivity and de-individuation. The egalitarian substance of the Communist Party comes from fidelity to the discharge, rather than, say, from a claim to represent the working class in the sphere of politics. The party doesn't represent a subject, it works to produce the subject to which it will have been faithful. In our present conjuncture, this means that a party of communists cannot confine itself within national histories and regional boundaries. To make the people appear as the subject of multiple riots and demonstrations, the party has to be as international as they are. Fortunately, there are glimpses of egalitarian fidelity actively holding open the rupture of the crowd event. Syriza, and to an extent Podemos, are examples here, particularly when conjoined into one subjective process that exceeds national boundaries. Globally, crowd intensities are forcing to presence the inability of democracy, particularly capitalist democracy, to name a politics of the people. The one name we have for a politics of the people that is also and necessarily anti-capitalist is communism. If we're not against capitalism, we are with it and against the people. So we have to organize as communists again.